Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Human trafficking. It's the abhorrent practice of recruiting and harboring a person for the purpose of compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. You might think this only happens in some faraway developing nation, but it happens right here in Canada too, and mostly for sexual exploitation. In the past decade, there have been more than 1,700 incidents of human trafficking reported by Canadian Police Services. 62% of the cases originate in the Greater Toronto Area, and 97% of the victims were women and girls. 74% of all the victims were actually under the age of 25. And sadly, these victims, again, they're just children. Victims, as well as their pimps, seem to be getting younger and younger. 92% of victims of human trafficking actually knew the person accused of trafficking them. It's also very big business. According to the International Labour Organization, globally, trafficking for sexual exploitation is approximately a $100 billion industry. One area in Canada, Peel region, which is located just outside of Toronto, has seen a 50% increase in human trafficking between 2009 and 2016. With its close access to the airport and major highways, Peel region is now considered a hub for this activity. So how do women and girls become victims of trafficking? How do we help the survivors of this horror? And what is being done to clamp down on this activity? And what are the signs to look out for to recognize if someone you know is being trafficked? Well, joining me now is Katarina McLeod, founder and executive director of Rising Angels Awareness and Restorative Care, an organization dedicated to educate the public on sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And more importantly, Katarina herself is a survivor of 15 years of sexual exploitation. Katarina, thank you so much for joining me today. It's not every day we delve into such a heavy topic, but I think it's a necessary one, and I really appreciate your time here. You were a victim for 15 years. Could you please share with our viewers the story of how you became a victim of human trafficking?
I ended up being lured in at 21 years old. I was actually went to a group for women who had been physically abused. So it was a support group. And from there, I got lured in from a pimp who kind of took advantage of what was going on in my life. So she knew that I was being physically abused. I had so much trauma growing up. So I think that left me very vulnerable. And, she was like, she owned a parlor and she was like, oh, you just have to come in and give a massage to men and that kind of stuff. You could make money, get out of your situation. And I didn't think that it was going to be what it ended up being. So I went, and to my shock, it was prostitution. And I ended up with her for a couple of years. And then I just kind of went on my own, just riding the circuit, stripping, going into different massage parlors, working out of my car, working out of apartments. And then I got lured in again with another pimp who promised me a better life. We were going to have a family. He loved me. We were going to live the dream. And I fell for it hook, line, and sinker again. And I ended up being trapped with him for about 4 years until I could finally escape.
So was there a defining moment, I suppose, where you realized this had to stop, that this is it's just too much and this has come to an end?
I think after, 15 years of being, sexually abused, I came to a point in myself where I was very suicidal. I was very broken. I was addicted to drugs. I knew I had to get out or I wasn't going to make it. And fortunately, I was able to get out with help. It takes a lot of help for women to be able to escape and to get their lives back.
So how did you get out?
I got out. It was it was a client who got me out and promised me, he would take care of me and my children. I had 4 children by this time. And he did. He absolutely took care of me for 3 years. But I realized in those 3 years, I became his private prostitute. And he left me and I had nothing. So again, I was going to go back to what I knew. And it was my daughter's youth group leaders who came alongside of me and offered me first and last and helped me get on my feet. And they've been my mentors for 9 years.
Wow, and what a story of survival that is. When we come back from the break, we're going to pick up this discussion on victims of sexual exploitation and how they emerge and what can be done in society. Stick around. Welcome back. We're discussing human trafficking in Canada. And joining in with Katarina McLeod, who was on my previous segment, is a panel to continue the discussion is Constable Joy Brown with the Community Mobilization Unit and Detective Jim Zucchero with the Human Trafficking Unit, both with the Peel Regional Police, and Sandra Rupnarain with Family Services of Peel. Thank you all so very much for being here with me for this important discussion. We were listening to Katarina's story just before the break, and she was explaining how she was a vulnerable person, and that's sort of one of the reasons she felt that she ended up in a circumstance where she was trafficked. Maybe I'll start with you, Sandra. Is that the typical demographic, or is that the typical circumstance in which we find victims entering sexual trafficking? They are vulnerable, and how are they vulnerable?
It is atypical, and oftentimes there's other avenues. One of the things that we have found as a family service organization, because we also do clinical counseling, is usually there are other factors, usually childhood issues, broken homes, being groomed, desire, poverty. There are other factors that are social factors that oftentimes contribute to individuals being more susceptible and vulnerable to being trafficked. So we find that in the work that we do when we, as Katarina indicated, it's just, there are other things in your life growing up as a child in a home. There's studies that have shown that oftentimes a lack of a proper father figure or early childhood abuse or exposure to experiences that young children should not have that are indicators that it makes them more vulnerable at a later life to be groomed and to be trafficked by those predators who are looking for individuals to traffic as well.
And Katarina, in your organization now, you help women emerging from this lifestyle, from this predatory industry. Is that your experience as well, that the women generally come from some kind of broken, some kind of problematic scenario, and then they're finding themselves being trafficked?
Yeah, I would have to agree with Sandra. I mean, probably 90% of the women that we mentor and counsel have all had some form of sexual abuse that's happened to them as a child that was left unresolved. A lot of bullying going on, self-worth issues. So we're seeing that these guys are grabbing onto this, and that's what they're exploiting with these girls. And so this is something we're seeing happen a lot.
And maybe I'll ask this question next to Constable Brown. In your experience, what is the age? We know most of the victims are women, but what is the age demographic? What socioeconomic status? Where do these victims come from? What's the demographic?
Well, I think they can actually come from anywhere, and it could be any sort of socioeconomic background. And that's one of the things that we kind of should keep in mind, although some of these other things that were mentioned make people a little bit more susceptible to being trafficked. There's also that self-esteem issue as well, which is a huge issue. And then there's basically, when we look at young people on a whole, there's a lot of young people with self-esteem issues. So somebody who's paying extra attention to them and, showering them with gifts and telling them that they are the be-all, end-all is a way that they're able to actually recruit.
Okay, thank you. And Detective Jim, earlier I was chatting and I was mentioning that there has been a spike in cases in Peel region, that it's doubled, if you will. What is the cause of the spike in Peel region?
I think when you look at a spike, it's dependent on it's something where a lot of, based on similar to how we're talking about it today, a lot of it comes down to awareness. And there's been a lot more training and a lot more awareness regarding human trafficking, not just out there in the media, but amongst service provision and amongst policing as a whole, so that we have the ability now that we're recognizing scenarios a lot more often and putting in place the
resources to address them. So again, I think a lot of that comes from the awareness that's occurring in relation to the community as a whole, to identify that it's actually occurring.
Because I think it's important to remind viewers, because not everybody's familiar with Peel Region. This is a national program, but Peel Region is a fairly suburban community. It's the bedroom community to Toronto. So I think it's shocking, for me, hearing that in this, residential community, this is where there's a spike in cases.
Yeah.
Detective Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. But what we have to consider as well is within Peel Region, we have an extremely large population, as well as our 400 series highways and the number of hotels, including the airport, that are included within Peel Region.
Welcome back. We're having a panel discussion on human trafficking. And right now we're discussing why there's a spike in cases in Peel Region, which is near Toronto, just to the west of Toronto. Detective Jim, just before we went to commercial, you were saying because of its close proximity to the airport, the major highways, that this is why you're finding that there's an increase in cases in your region.
And well, as we're looking at that, if you look at the close proximity of the major cities, like the close proximity to the border, we're a 5-hour drive away from a city as large as Montreal, the Ottawa area. And when we talk about those cases being within Peel Region, we have to remember that these cases aren't isolated to Peel Region. One of the major factors with human trafficking is the transportation between different areas and regions. So when we look at those cases that are identified as being within Peel Region, they aren't necessarily isolated to that region. Those individuals are being trafficked outside of Peel Region as well. They'll be trafficked, whether it be in the Greater Toronto area, Hull, Windsor, other provinces. It's just, I think we've done a great job here in Peel with a lot of the partnerships that we've developed, where with Family Service Appeal, with other service provision agencies, as well as our policing partners and our other law enforcement partners, to really be able to identify these circumstances where human trafficking may be occurring.
Now, Katerina, you and I were chatting a couple weeks ago when we were preparing for this show, and I mentioned to you that I had recalled seeing in the newspaper, at least a couple times in the past year, teenager girls who were high school students being trafficked, right outside of their high school. Can you explain what's going on and why are there such young victims?
Well, I mean, if I'm to talk about it, I mean, there's a couple of girls that I actually am walking alongside of who were trafficked right out of their high school. So they would take the bus in the morning, get dropped off at school, and the trafficker would pick them up, traffic them all day, take them back in time for the bus. And the schools weren't even calling home to let the parents know that their daughter hadn't been in school all day. And they were just dismissing her as, the problem child. She had an addiction. She went from being an 90% student to, becoming depressed, becoming addicted because this was happening to her. What we are seeing and what I'm seeing a lot of is this whole pimp culture is becoming normalized. And, we have media that's playing a huge role in it. You see these music videos now and there's, 10 women dressed scandalously, around one man dancing, and we're all sexualized and our kids are being desensitized. And, my kids came home to me when they were in high school and said, Mom, it's cool to have a main girlfriend and a side girlfriend. Well, that's pimp lingo. So we are normalizing this, and we're seeing a lot of girls who are saying, well, hey, I want to buy stuff. I want to do stuff. I can have, oral sex in the bathroom for $20. Then we're seeing, boys jumping on this bandwagon of wanting to be cool and pimping out women. The youngest pimp that I've seen to date is 15 years old.
My goodness, that's young. I'm shocked to hear that. I truly am. Sandra, chime in here. You probably deal with a lot of the aftermath of when these families come to you and say, we didn't know our daughter was being trafficked. How do you deal with this? How do you help the parents come to terms with what's happened?
That's one of the challenges we often experience, because by the time often we are working with a family, we can say that that individual is suffering sort of a Stockholm Syndrome, where at that point in time, that individual might be so caught up because, they're so identifying with the victim. We often find that oftentimes with the girls that we work with and the families we work with, if the supports are not there sufficiently to transition them out from human trafficking, and I think Katarina can attest to it, it's just not okay to say, well, we're going to provide you sessions, we're going to support you. There's so many other pieces that needs to happen simultaneously, because oftentimes they don't have a clue as to how to live their lives. And what is a wraparound service we need to provide for them to get them, it's okay to say one of the things that came up in Peel is about housing. Right. And housing is always an issue, and it's important to get them housed. But what do you provide for them as you're housing them? Oftentimes, they don't know how to balance a checkbook. They don't know how to prepare a meal. They would know how to dress. The basic things we take for granted. And how do we support them in that transition? Because oftentimes, if they're left on their own, it's very easy for them to fall back into the game. Because what is familiar is what they gravitate to. Not that it's good for them, but it feels comfortable. It feels familiar. And I say comfortable with air commas because it's not comfortable in the sense it's right, but we have the sense in sort of psychology, people adapt to what they know as their norm. And anything outside of that becomes a challenge to adapt to. Right. So the service that really needs to happen really has to be a wraparound care from all sectors to provide that sense of take away that shame, that humiliation.
I'm going to put a pause right just for a moment. Welcome back. Once again, we're having a panel discussion on human trafficking in Canada with a focus on Peel region, which is just outside the Greater Toronto area, just outside Toronto proper. Just before the break, Sandra, we were talking about the care that's required when someone emerges from human trafficking environment. Please go ahead and finish your thought there.
Once we meet with them and we provide the support we need, is getting them into the proper accommodations that we could get them supported. Sometimes there's medical that's needed, financial that's needed, helping them to get financially settled. So the coordination of the services needs to happen at all levels. Oftentimes, one of the stuff that we have experienced is that they feel used already. So anything that feels like it's going to use them to get to an end can be very challenging to get them engaged. So you try to connect with them at a level to make them feel as, they belong and they're part of community and society. And finding that wraparound service can be quite a challenge because it's how do we get them where they need to go and how do we develop the skills that they need to develop? And that is what's missing.
Well, it's a big...
And don't forget that...
I was going to say it sounds like a very big task, and yes. It's a tall order, and it's so important. I want to ask Constable Brown a question now. On the policing end of it, what are police doing, or what can be done in this area to clamp down on human trafficking, so we don't hear stories of teenagers being trafficked out of school and parents not knowing about it because it's happening during school hours and that sort of thing?
I think basically we're looking at education. So educating not only, the students, which our crime prevention unit does, but also educating parents, educating our service providers, making sure that they have that information, and that whole prevention piece as well. I know that we've worked very closely with our community partners around that education piece, but not also education, but also any sort of wraparound support, as Sandra was talking about. I'm not sure if you know, but the region of Peel developed a regional strategy, which is prevention, intervention, as well as housing, which is exits. And they put some dollars towards the intervention as well as the prevention. So Sandra was talking about the intervention and services working together, which we do already now, but making it a little bit more formalized. So there is going to be a hub. It's opening actually in the fall of this year, where victims and survivors can access those services in one place. As Sandra mentioned, sometimes you have to kind of go to different places, and it makes it very difficult for that person who's experiencing the trauma that they're experiencing. But if we have those services in one place, right, and people are able to access those right away, it's very, very important. As well as the housing piece also has, service providers that are able to come on site, able to provide all of that wraparound support that they need. and not only the supports at the time, but ongoing supports, and linking them with long-term care with our service providers as well.
Okay, I want to change gears for a second because we've talked about the victims, which is obviously paramount. What about in the minute we have left here, what about the perpetrators? What about these pimps? What is the typical sentence when they're found guilty of somebody found guilty of human trafficking? Detective Jim, would you like to chime in there?
I think all of us clearly agree that not long enough is the easiest answer. I don't know the average sentence off the top of my head, but anywhere between 5 and 8 years is what we're looking for a human trafficking conviction. And I'm telling you, on that high end, it's very, very rare. It's something that I think it comes down to, it's a challenge. And not just the investigations, but also the prosecutions, they are challenging. But when it comes down to it, it's extremely important. And I think it's the more that we get this messaging out there about what's happening, and the more that we're able to speak with survivors like Katerina,
right,
and the community and the judiciary understand and hear the impact.
Right. I'm going to have to hold you there. I'm sorry. We've run out of time. My apologies, Detective Jim. But I want to thank each of you for your generosity in this time today for this very important discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a very jarring discussion, but an important one, because we know that human trafficking is on the rise, and we have to look out for our neighbors, our family, and other children who are being sexually exploited. For Counterpoint, this is Tanya Granick-Allen.